Hello and welcome back. I'm so glad you could join me tonight for another story. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, comment, and let me know where you're listening from. If you're enjoying these tales, be sure to subscribe so you never miss one. Now, let's settle in and prepare for a journey. This one might make you look over your shoulder once or twice. It was a typical Thursday evening when I first noticed something was off. The air felt a little cooler than usual, a gentle breeze seeping through the cracks of my old farmhouse, the kind of draft that only seems to appear when you're least expecting it. I had just finished dinner. Something simple, a bowl of pasta, nothing fancy. The routine had been the same for weeks now. Cook, eat, clean up, then retreat to the comfort of my armchair by the window. I always found solace in the quiet moments, the silence of the evening, the rustling of the trees in the distance, and the steady hum of the old house settling around me. It was peaceful, normal, the kind of evening that lulls you into a false sense of security. But as I sank into the chair, something caught my attention. It wasn't a sound, not exactly, more like a shift in the air. A faint, almost imperceptible movement that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I paused, staring into the shadows beyond the window. There was nothing there, just the usual landscape, the darkening trees, the winding creek that snaked through the valley, and the soft glow of the moon reflecting off the water. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I was just tired, or my mind was playing tricks on me. I reached for my cup of tea, hoping the warmth would settle my nerves, but as I lifted it to my lips, a faint creaking sound echoed from the hallway. I froze. The sound was subtle, almost too quiet to be certain. It was the kind of creak you hear when an old house shifts, but this one was different. It was more deliberate, like someone had stepped on the floorboards just outside my room. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting company. I hadn't invited anyone over, and yet there it was, the unmistakable sound of someone or something moving in the hallway. I set the cup down gently, trying to stay calm. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe it was just the house. The floorboards were old, and it had been a while since I had the place inspected. But the longer I listened, the more certain I became. Someone was out there. I stood up, slowly trying to make as little noise as possible. I crept toward the hallway, the shadows stretching long and dark in the dim light of the evening. My footsteps were soft, careful, but my heart was racing. The hallway was empty, no one in sight. I breathed a sigh of relief, but something in the air felt off. It was too quiet now. The kind of silence that wraps around you, heavy and suffocating. I stood there for a moment, straining my ears, waiting for any sound, any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Just as I was about to turn back, I noticed something strange. The front door, which I was sure I had locked earlier, was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness between the frame and the door. It wasn't much, but enough to make my stomach drop. Had I left it unlocked? No, I was certain I hadn't. I'd checked it every night without fail. But now, there it was. Open, just enough to let in a cold draft. Exercise. One more thing, I thought out loud. I took a step toward it, my pulse quickening. What was going on? Had someone broken in? But then why hadn't I heard anything? No glass breaking, no loud noises, nothing to suggest an intrusion. I approached the door cautiously, my hand hovering over the handle. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind, but none of them made sense. The house was quiet again, too quiet. I slowly closed the door, locking it firmly behind me, but even as I did, a sinking feeling in my gut told me this wasn't over. The air felt different now, thicker, like something was waiting, just out of sight. I glanced back down the hallway, half expecting to see something or someone standing there. But there was nothing. just the same old shadows stretching further into the darkness. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It was just a draft, I told myself. Maybe the wind had pushed the door open. Maybe the old wood was settling. Nothing to be afraid of. But as I turned to head back to the living room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something was watching me. The night wore on, but the unease didn't fade. In fact, it only deepened, wrapping itself around me like a suffocating blanket. I tried to focus on the small, comforting things, the ticking of the clock on the mantel, the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth, the gentle clink of my teacup against the saucer, but none of it seemed to settle my nerves. I paused at the door and looked back at the saucer, but nothing had changed, and no reaction had appeared. The night wore on, but the ticking of the clock on the mantel, the soft sound, the snaps of the fire in the hearth, the gentle clink of my teacup against the saucer, but none of it seemed to settle my nerves. The house, though quiet, felt different. The air seemed to press in on me, heavy and unyielding, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The wind outside had picked up, rustling the trees and making the windows rattle. A storm was coming, that was all. Storm was coming, that was all. But then I heard it again. A soft thud from upstairs, just loud enough to catch my attention, but too quiet to be certain. I froze, listening intently. My mind raced through possibilities. Was it just the house settling again, or something more? The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. Stood, heart pounding, my legs feeling heavy as I made my way toward the stairs. The old wooden steps creaked under my weight, echoing in the stillness. Each step felt like an eternity. The thud came again, this time closer. I hesitated, standing at the bottom of the stairs, straining to hear. Was someone up there? Was it a person, or something else? Hesitation. I slowly ascended, each step making the old wood groan in protest. The second floor was dark, save for the faint moonlight filtering through the small windows. My breath seemed to catch in my throat as I reached the top of the stairs. The house was still. Too still. I moved down the narrow hallway toward the room at the end. My own room, the place where I had just been moments before, sitting in the comfort of my chair, lost in the quiet rhythm of the evening. But now the room felt wrong. I stood outside the door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window, causing me to flinch. I took a deep breath, gathering my courage, and pushed the door open. It was empty. Nothing out of the ordinary, no sign of an intruder, no hidden dangers lurking in the shadows. The bed was neatly made, the dresser untouched. The room was as I had left it. Yet, as I stepped inside, the air seemed heavier here, thicker, like the room itself was holding on to something. A secret, a memory, a presence. Happiness transformed my body. I walked over to the window, pulling back the curtains just enough to peer out. The wind was picking up, sending the branches of the trees swaying wildly in the distance. The creek, visible from my window, looked darker than usual, the water flowing swiftly, almost angrily, as if something was disturbing it. Then, as I gazed into the darkened woods beyond, I saw it. A shadow. A figure. Just a silhouette against the backdrop of the trees. It was hard to make out, but it was there, standing motionless. I blinked and it was gone. I shook my head, dismissing it as a trick of the light, or my mind playing games with me. I was tired. Maybe the storm was affecting my senses, but the feeling didn't fade. It lingered, growing stronger. I'd never had a sensation so like lingering before. It started off with the dawn of sleepiness, but with time and exhaustion, it grew stronger. I turned away from the window, trying to focus on something, anything, to ground myself. But then I heard it again. A whisper, so faint I could barely make it out. It came from behind me. Help me. I spun around, heart racing, but the room was still empty. My breath caught in my throat as I searched the shadows, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Was I hearing things? Or was something truly in the room with me? The room fell silent. The whisper came again, this time louder, more distinct. Help me. It wasn't my imagination. It was real. I took a hesitant step back toward the door, my hand trembling on the knob. But before I could turn it, I felt a cold breeze sweep past me, and the door slammed shut with a force that sent me stumbling back. The room plunged into darkness. My heart thudded in my chest and panic surged through me. I fumbled for the light switch, my fingers trembling, but the room remained dark. The air felt colder now, an icy chill that cut through me like a knife. I wasn't alone. Something was here. The darkness around me was thick, almost suffocating. My breath quickened, and I could feel the weight of something unseen pressing down on me. I reached out, my hand trembling as it searched for the door handle. The cold air seemed to pulse around me, alive with a presence I couldn't explain. Suddenly, the door creaked open on its own. I stumbled back, a sharp gasp escaping my lips as I found myself in the hallway once more. The cold was still there, biting into my skin, but the oppressive weight had lifted, just slightly. I didn't dare turn around, didn't dare to see what might be lurking in the room behind me. I forced myself to move, to put one foot in front of the other, to keep going. I had to find answers. Whatever was happening, it wasn't something I could ignore. I reached the stairs again, the old wood creaking beneath my feet as I descended. My mind raced with questions. Was I losing my grip on reality? Or was there something truly haunting this house, something tied to the land itself? The stories I'd heard growing up about Hollow Creek flashed in my mind. The strange disappearances, the odd occurrences, the whispers of restless spirits that never left. But I had never believed them, not really. Not until now. The air downstairs was still thick, the unease returning in waves. I stepped into the living room where the fireplace was still crackling softly. It seemed like the only familiar thing in the house now, something that anchored me to reality. But even the comfort of the fire couldn't dispel the feeling of being watched. I glanced around the room, half expecting to see something, or someone, standing in the shadows. The room was empty, save for the furniture, but I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. A soft knock at the door. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. Who could it be? There was no one else here, and the storm had grown more intense, the wind howling outside. I hesitated, but curiosity won out. I made my way to the door, my footsteps muffled by the carpet. "Grace, look," I said. His face turned toward the door. I looked into her dark gray eyes. I opened it slowly, the hinges creaking as the door swung wide. No one. But the cold air hit me like a slap, and as I stepped outside, I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the porch, barely visible in the darkness. It was tall, shadowy, and indistinct, as though it was a part of the night itself. The wind howled around it, but it didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. I took a step forward, my heart in my throat. "Hello?" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the storm. No answer. The figure remained still, unmoving. My instinct screamed at me to run, to turn and lock the door behind me, but something held me in place. Something about the figure felt familiar, externally. I stepped closer, my eyes straining to make out any detail, but just as I reached the edge of the porch, the figure was gone, vanished into the night, as if it had never been there at all. I stood frozen, the silence swallowing me whole. The wind whipped through the trees, but everything else was still. It was as if the world had paused, holding its breath. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. Was it a trick of the light? A figment of my imagination? Doubt. This was real. Whatever it was here. I closed the door with a shaking hand, bolting it shut behind me. My thoughts were jumbled, my heart still pounding in my chest. What was happening? What did it want? I had to find out. I paced the room, trying to steady my breathing. I needed to think. I needed to get a grip on myself. Then I heard it again, the whisper, soft, almost like a sigh, but distinct. Come closer. I froze. The voice was coming from the hallway, from the same place where the shadow had been. I stood still for a moment, my mind torn between fear and curiosity. What could it be? Was it the same presence from before? The same voice? Had to know. I had to face whatever it was. With hesitant steps, I made my way down the hall, the whisper growing louder, clearer. It wasn't just a voice. It was a plea, a cry for help. I reached the end of the hallway and stopped in front of the old study. The door was ajar, just slightly, as though inviting me in. The whisper was louder now, almost urgent. Come closer. Help me. I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The room was dark, save for the faint light coming from the crack in the window. My eyes adjusted slowly to the dimness, and there, standing in the center of the room, was the figure. It wasn't the same as before. Not quite. This one was different, more solid, more human. A woman, or at least what appeared to be a woman, draped in tattered clothing. Her hair was long and unkempt, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow, with an emptiness that sent a chill down my spine. She didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel her presence. She was waiting for something. For me. I stood there in the doorway, frozen, my breath catching in my throat. The woman, if she could be called that, didn't move. Her hollow eyes staring through me as though she could see into the very core of my being. The air in the room had grown even colder, a biting chill that seemed to wrap around my skin, pulling me in, holding me captive in this strange moment. I didn't dare step forward. Something in the back of my mind told me that if I did, I might never return. But the whisper, the faint, pleading whisper, echoed again, growing stronger, almost desperate. Help me. I took a tentative step into the room, my heart thundering in my chest. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, and I winced at the sound, half expecting the woman to react, to lash out in some way. But she remained still, her gaze never leaving me. Who are you? My voice trembled, barely a whisper against the heavy silence that surrounded us. No response. I stepped closer, the chill intensifying with each movement. I could feel my own breath fogging in front of me, as if the very air in the room was freezing. The woman's eyes followed me, but she didn't speak. It was as if she was waiting for me to understand something I wasn't ready for. Then, the faintest of movements caught my eye. Her hand twitched just barely, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. Slowly, as though every action was a struggle, she raised her hand and pointed toward the far wall. I followed her gaze, my eyes scanning the dim room. There, near the window, was a framed photograph. It looked old, the edges of the frame chipped and worn. The photo itself was faded, the faces barely visible in the yellowed image. But there was something familiar about it, something that made my stomach twist with unease. I took a step toward it, my hand trembling as I reached for the frame. As soon as my fingers brushed the glass, a sharp pain shot through my chest. I gasped, stumbling back, clutching at my heart. The room spun around me, and for a moment I thought I might fall. The woman's eyes were now wide, filled with something that looked almost like fear, though her expression never changed. The whisper came again, this time more frantic. Don't touch it. Don't. I pulled my hand away from the photo, my pulse racing, the pain in my chest subsiding but not entirely gone. I couldn't understand what was happening, but the air in the room felt thick with something sinister. The woman's gaze never wavered from me, but her expression softened, just slightly. "You don't know. You don't understand," she whispered, her voice so faint that it was barely audible. "Who are you?" I asked again, my voice barely more than a breath. She tilted her head slightly, as if considering my question. Then, in a voice that seemed to echo from a distant place, she finally spoke. "I am the one who was forgotten, the one who was lost." The words sent a chill through me, as though they carried with them a weight I wasn't prepared to bear. I wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but the words caught in my throat. Something about her presence made it hard to think, to focus. It was as if the room itself was pressing in on me, pushing me to forget, to leave. But I couldn't. I couldn't leave until I understood. "What happened to you?" I managed to ask, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at me. She didn't answer right away. Instead, her eyes seemed to drift toward the photograph again. "That was the day it all began," she said, her voice distant, almost like a memory. "The day they took him." I felt a sudden, inexplicable pull toward the photograph once more. This time, I couldn't resist. My feet moved of their own accord, my hand reaching out to touch the frame again, despite the warning in the woman's voice. The moment my fingers brushed the glass, the vision flooded my mind. The world around me seemed to dissolve, and I was no longer in the room with the woman. I was somewhere else, somewhere dark and cold. I could hear the sound of heavy breathing, the muffled voices of people arguing in the distance. I saw a figure, tall, with broad shoulders, his face obscured by shadows. He was kneeling beside a small, crumpled body, whispering something I couldn't hear. The image flickered, like a broken film reel, and then another scene appeared. This time the man was holding a knife, his hands stained with something dark. I gasped, the vision breaking apart as quickly as it had come. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest, the air around me thick with panic. The woman was standing now, her face contorted in an expression of pain. "You saw it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You saw what they did." I tried to speak, to ask her what I had seen, but the words wouldn't come. The image of the man, his hands stained with blood, lingered in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had witnessed something far more terrible than I was prepared to understand. My eyes flicked back to the bundle in the corner of the room. The woman's gaze softened, almost sorrowful. "You have to know," she said, her voice breaking. "You have to remember what happened. The truth will set you free, but it will also destroy you." I swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking into my chest like a stone. What truth? What had happened here? I glanced back at the photograph, the faces in the image now clearer, more distinct. There was the man, his features now recognizable, but it was the woman beside him that caught my attention. Her face, though faint, was one I knew. It was my mother. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. My mother? The woman in the photograph, the one from the dark vision, was my mother. But how could that be? She had never spoken of this place, never mentioned anything about the man or the horrors that seemed to linger in the air of this house. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. My mother had never been one to share much about her past, always keeping things close, tucked away like secrets in a locked chest. But this was something else. This was a connection to something far darker, something that felt like it had been hidden from me for my entire life. The woman, the specter who had haunted me since I stepped into this house, took a slow step toward me. Her presence seemed to fill the room, pressing down on me with a weight that made it hard to breathe. "You see it now," she whispered, her voice like a soft breeze, though her words carried the heaviness of a storm. "You understand why I am here." I couldn't speak. My mouth felt dry, my heart racing. My mother had been involved in something terrible, and I was caught in the aftermath, like a moth drawn to a flame that would burn me alive. Oof. "What happened?" I managed to croak, my voice barely audible. "What happened to him?" The woman's eyes flickered with something like sorrow, though it was impossible to tell if it was genuine. "They took him," she repeated, her voice low and mournful. "The man in the photograph, the one you saw. He was my husband." "And your father?" "Yes." "The way he reacted. The way he handled his grief," she said. "The one he lost. I would never be the same." The words struck me with the force of a hammer. My father? The man in the vision had been my father? It must have been my invisible enemy who had prepared this hammer for me in the bunker in the mountainside. I had always known that my mother had been married before, but she had never talked about him. The details were sparse, the memory of him blurred. She had always been vague when I asked, telling me only that he had left when I was young. She had never mentioned his death, his disappearance, or anything that could explain why she had always carried such a quiet sadness with her. "Why didn't she tell me?" I whispered to myself, though the words felt wrong, as if the answer was already written in the shadows of the house. The woman didn't answer at first. Instead, she turned her gaze to the window, as if lost in a memory too painful to relive. "Because the truth is a poison," she murmured. "Some things are better left buried." He thought. Couldn't stop myself. "What happened to him?" I repeated, louder this time, my voice shaking with urgency. "Why is he in that photograph? What is all of this?" She slowly turned back to me, her face a mask of sorrow. "He died here, in this house, and so did I." I stared at her, my breath catching in my throat. You died here?" The woman nodded, her eyes clouded with a deep, unspoken grief. "We were both taken by the same darkness, by the thing that lives here, in the walls, in the air. It consumes everything, leaving nothing but whispers and regret. Your father tried to fight it, but in the end he was no match for it." The weight of her words pressed down on me like a physical force, and I felt as though I might suffocate under the pressure of it all. The house, this cursed haunted place, was more than just a home. It was a prison, a tomb, and I had stepped right into its grip. "You need to leave," the woman said suddenly, her voice sharp with urgency. "You can't stay here. It will take you too if you don't leave now." I didn't understand. Leave? How could I leave? The truth was unfolding in front of me piece by piece, and I couldn't walk away without knowing the full story, without understanding what had happened to my family, to my mother, to my father. But something in her gaze, something in the air, told me that if I didn't leave soon, I might never leave at all. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows in the corners of the room stretching longer, more sinister. I could feel the presence of something else, something that wasn't her, something that had been waiting for me, lurking in the silence. I took a hesitant step back, but the woman reached out, her hand hovering just above my arm. Her touch was cold, icy, and for a moment I felt as though I might freeze where I stood. "Don't let it get you," she whispered, her voice filled with a strange kind of urgency. "Don't let it take you the way it took us." I looked into her eyes, and for the first time I saw something other than sorrow, something like fear. Real, palpable fear. All he thought he was giving to his father's loving sister, and someone who just like her. I turned, my heart pounding in my chest, and ran. My feet carried me through the house, through the winding hallways, past the creaking doors and the long, dark corridors. But the air around me grew heavier, thicker, and the sound of my footsteps echoed in my ears like a warning. FDS. But back to patience and safe sleep. The house was alive. It was watching me, waiting for me to slip. I reached the front door, my hand shaking as I grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door, like everything else in this cursed place, was locked, as if it were a prison meant to keep me inside. I stood there, and then, in the corner of my vision, I saw it. The figure of a man, standing in the shadows of the hallway. His face was obscured by darkness, but his presence was unmistakable. My father. I could feel the blood drain from my face as I stood frozen, staring at the man who had haunted my dreams for as long as I could remember. But this wasn't a dream. This was real. This was happening. You. The figure stepped forward, his face slowly becoming visible in the dim light. But it wasn't my father. It was the man from the photograph, the one who had been lost to time, to death, to the darkness, and he was staring directly at me. The man in the hallway stepped forward, his figure becoming clearer with each step, the shadows seeming to bend around him. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The air felt thick, suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in. His eyes, dark, empty voids, locked onto mine with an intensity that sent a cold shiver down my spine. The infernal's body slammed into mine as I slid from the balcony to the ground below and scrambled to my feet. I could barely move. Every instinct told me to run, to escape, but my legs refused to obey. My body felt as though it were rooted to the spot, unable to break free from the grip of whatever dark force had taken hold of this place. The man spoke, his voice low and gravelly, like the rumble of thunder far off in the distance. "You're too late," he said, his words wrapping around me like a vice. "You should have left when you had the chance." I tried to speak, to ask who he was, to demand answers, but the words stuck in my throat. The terror was overwhelming, paralyzing, and I couldn't find the strength to fight it. His form shifted slightly, like smoke in the wind, and for a moment I thought I saw my father's face, a glimpse of something familiar beneath the veil of darkness. But it was fleeting, vanishing before I could make sense of it. The man stepped closer, and I felt the temperature drop, the air growing colder with each passing second. The walls of the house seemed to groan, as if they were alive, feeding off the fear that radiated from me. "You're part of it now," he said, his voice softer, almost coaxing. "You've seen too much. You've learned too much. You can't leave." His words hit me like a blow to the chest. I tried to back away, but the door behind me still refused to open. It felt as though the house itself had turned against me, trapping me in this nightmare with no way out. And then I heard it. A soft, whispering voice from the shadows. A voice that was all too familiar. "Christina, don't listen to him," my mother's voice said, clear and strong, cutting through the suffocating darkness. "You're not trapped. You can still leave." I spun around, searching for her, but the room was empty. There was no trace of her, just the darkness and the man who had claimed my father's form. "Your mother is gone," the man hissed, his voice turning cruel. "She was never meant to save you. She was part of this place. Just like you are now." The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and for the first time, I understood. The house, the darkness, it was all connected. My family, my mother, my father, had been consumed by it. And now, it was my turn. But then, in the depths of the terror, something stirred within me, a spark of defiance. I wasn't going to let this place claim me too. I wasn't going to let it take me the way it had taken them. "I am all alone," I thought to the robots, as the creatures destroyed the cabin. I took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of strength I had left. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling but determined. "I won't let you have me." The man in the shadows smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a chill through my bones. "You can't fight it. You're already part of it." But then, just as his words echoed in the air, something changed. The house seemed to groan as though it were resisting him. The walls shook, and the shadows around me wavered, like smoke being blown away by a sudden gust of wind. And then, in the blink of an eye, the man was gone. The darkness lifted, and the air felt lighter, less suffocating. I stood there, panting, my heart racing in my chest. The room was still, silent, and for the first time since I had entered the house, it felt like I could breathe again. It was a bittersweet moment for me as well. As I trudged back to the kitchen, I held Haley closer, feeling her weight against my leg. I ran to the door, my hand shaking as I gripped the handle. This time, it opened. I didn't hesitate. I didn't look back. I fled into the night, the cold air biting at my skin, but I didn't care. I was free. I didn't know what had happened to the house, to the man, to the specter of my mother, but I knew one thing: the nightmare was over. For now. I looked back once, just once, as I walked away, and for a fleeting moment I thought I saw her, my mother, standing in the doorway, watching me. But then she was gone, just like the rest of them. And the silence of Hollow Creek settled back into the night.